The smell of fresh coffee and vanilla candles filled the pristine kitchen of our family home in Westchester County, New York, on that crisp October morning in 2019. I was sitting at the familiar oak table where I'd eaten countless breakfasts as a child, watching my sister Rebecca arrange white lilies in an expensive crystal vase with the same meticulous attention she'd always given to making everything in her life appear perfect. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 35 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've lived in the shadow of my younger sister Rebecca, who is 32 but has always carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she was destined for greatness. While I struggled through community college and worked multiple jobs to pay my way, Rebecca sailed through Yale on our parents' dime, graduated summa cum laude, and married Bradley Stone, a successful investment banker whose family owned half of Manhattan's Upper East Side. Our father, Robert Mitchell, had been the vice president of a major pharmaceutical company for over 20 years. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and kind blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Our mother, Margaret Mitchell, was a former beauty queen who had never quite gotten over the fact that her reign as Miss Connecticut 1975 had ended, and she spent most of her energy trying to relive her glory days through Rebecca's achievements. The house where we'd grown up was a testament to my parents' success and my sister's favored status. The walls were lined with Rebecca's academic awards, her sorority photos from Yale, professional headshots from her brief modeling career, and pictures from her lavish wedding to Bradley 3 years earlier. If you walked through our family home, you'd think the Mitchells had only one daughter. I, on the other hand, had exactly 3 photos displayed in the entire house: my high school graduation picture tucked away in the upstairs hallway, a family Christmas photo from 2010 where I was barely visible behind Rebecca's perfectly coiffed hair, and one small snapshot of me at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning, that my father had kept on his office desk for reasons I never understood. The contrast between Rebecca and me had been apparent from early childhood. She was born with platinum blonde hair, bright green eyes, and delicate features that made strangers stop my mother on the street to compliment her beautiful little angel. I had inherited my father's darker coloring, brown hair, brown eyes, and what my mother diplomatically called a more substantial build. But the physical differences were nothing compared to the treatment we received growing up. Rebecca's bedroom was twice the size of mine, decorated with expensive furniture and updated every few years to match her evolving tastes. She had a walk-in closet filled with designer clothes, her own bathroom with a marble vanity, and a canopy bed that looked like something out of a fairy tale. My room, meanwhile, was what the real estate listings would generously call cozy. It had been decorated once when I was 12 with a generic pink and white theme from Target, and it stayed exactly the same until I moved out at 19. I shared a bathroom with the guest room, and my clothes hung in a small closet that barely fit my modest wardrobe. The differential treatment extended far beyond bedroom assignments. When Rebecca turned 16, our parents threw her a lavish Sweet 16 party at the country club, complete with a live band, professional photographer, and a guest list of over 200 people. The party cost more than most people's annual salary, and Rebecca received a brand new BMW as a surprise gift, presented with great fanfare as the finale of the evening. When I turned 16 2 months later, my parents took me to dinner at Olive Garden and gave me a used Honda Civic that they'd purchased from our neighbor for $3,000. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful for the car and the dinner. But sitting in that Olive Garden booth, watching my parents check their phones while I blew out a single candle on a slice of tiramisu, I couldn't help but notice the stark difference in how my milestone birthday was celebrated compared to Rebecca's elaborate affair. The academic expectations were equally skewed. Rebecca was enrolled in private tutoring from elementary school onward, participated in every enrichment program money could buy, and was groomed for Ivy League success from the time she could walk. Her college application process involved hiring a private college counselor, taking expensive SAT prep courses, and applying to 15 schools, including all the Ivies. When it came time for my college applications, my parents handed me a stack of brochures for local community colleges and state schools, along with financial aid forms and a lecture about being realistic about your abilities and our budget. They didn't offer to pay for SAT prep, college counseling, or application fees for multiple schools. I was expected to figure it out on my own and be grateful for whatever opportunities came my way. The message was clear: Rebecca was the investment, I was the expense. This dynamic played out in countless small moments throughout our childhood. When we both expressed interest in piano lessons, Rebecca got the beautiful baby grand piano that still sits in our living room, along with weekly lessons from a renowned instructor who charged $150 per hour. I got a keyboard from Walmart and a book of beginner songs that I was expected to teach myself. When Rebecca wanted to try horseback riding, our parents enrolled her at an exclusive equestrian center where she learned dressage and competed in regional shows. When I mentioned that I might like to try riding too, my mother suggested I volunteer at the local animal shelter to get my horse fixed for free. The pattern was so consistent that I stopped asking for things by the time I was 13. Why request something that would inevitably be denied or given in a watered-down version? It was easier to learn to want less, to expect less, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention or resources came my way. But perhaps the most painful part of growing up as the other daughter wasn't the material differences, it was the emotional favoritism that permeated every family interaction. When Rebecca got her first boyfriend at 15, my mother spent hours helping her pick out outfits, giving her advice about dating, and treating the relationship like the most important diplomatic negotiation in world history. When I started dating Michael Chen, a sweet boy from my calculus class, my mother's only comment was, "Try not to get pregnant." When Rebecca had friendship drama with her sorority sisters, my parents would spend entire dinners discussing strategies for resolving the conflicts, analyzing every text message and social media post like foreign policy experts. When I had problems with my college roommate who was stealing my food and bringing random men into our dorm room at all hours, my father's advice was, "Life's tough, Sarah. Learn to deal with it." Rebecca's achievements were family celebrations, mine were footnotes. When she made Dean's List every semester at Yale, my parents would post about it on Facebook, call all the relatives, and take her out for expensive dinners. When I graduated from community college with highest honors and received a full scholarship to finish my bachelor's degree at SUNY Purchase, my mother's response was, "That's nice, honey. Rebecca's bringing Bradley to dinner on Sunday, so make sure you're not here to make things awkward." The worst part was that Rebecca wasn't even cruel about her favored status, she simply accepted it as the natural order of things. She genuinely believed she deserved the extra attention, the larger investments, the endless support because she was the successful one. In her mind, our parents' differential treatment wasn't unfair, it was logical resource allocation. "Mom and Dad invest more in me because I give them better returns," she once explained to me during my sophomore year of college, as if she were discussing a stock portfolio rather than family relationships. "They know I'll make them proud and take care of them when they're older. It's just good sense." I was living in a tiny studio apartment near campus, working 25 hours a week at a campus bookstore and 15 hours a week at a local restaurant to pay for textbooks and living expenses my financial aid didn't cover. Rebecca was living in a luxury off-campus apartment that our parents paid for, complete with a car, credit card, and monthly allowance for miscellaneous expenses. During family gatherings, the conversation always centered around Rebecca's latest accomplishments, her social life, her career prospects, her relationship with Bradley. I would sit at the dinner table, listening to detailed discussions about her internship applications, her sorority formal themes, her post-graduation plans, feeling like a background character in someone else's life story. When relatives asked about me, my parents' responses were always brief and dismissive. "Sarah's doing fine. She's in school." Meanwhile, they could talk for 20 minutes straight about Rebecca's latest academic honor or social achievement. Extended family members learned quickly that the interesting Mitchell daughter was Rebecca, and I became accustomed to being an afterthought in conversations, present but not really seen. The financial inequity became even more apparent when we both entered the job market. Rebecca graduated from Yale with no student loans, a robust professional network built through our parents' connections, and a trust fund that would mature when she turned 30. She moved into a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan's Tribeca neighborhood, courtesy of our parents, while she found herself and decided on the perfect career path. I graduated from SUNY Purchase with $40,000 in student loan debt and immediately started working at a small nonprofit organization in Yonkers, making $35,000 a year and living in a studio apartment with thin walls and unreliable heating. When I mentioned to my parents that I was struggling financially, my father's advice was to work harder and spend less. When Rebecca mentioned she was thinking about switching careers from marketing to interior design, they funded a $25,000 certification program at the New York School of Interior Design. By the time I turned 30, I had worked my way up to a program coordinator position at a larger nonprofit focused on literacy programs for underprivileged children. I was making $52,000 a year, had finally paid off half my student loans, and had saved enough to move into a modest one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. I was proud of my independence and the work I was doing, even if it wasn't glamorous or particularly well compensated. Rebecca, meanwhile, had married Bradley in a $150,000 wedding that our parents helped fund, moved into a $2.8 million brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, and was working part-time as an interior designer for wealthy clients while Bradley's trust fund covered their substantial living expenses. She drove a Range Rover, vacationed in the Hamptons every summer, and wore jewelry that cost more than I made in 6 months. At family dinners, the conversation still revolved around Rebecca's world, her latest design projects, her charitable work with the Junior League, her and Bradley's plans to start a family, their weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard. When asked about my work with literacy programs, the response was polite but minimal interest. "That's nice that you're helping people," my mother would say before immediately pivoting to ask Rebecca about her latest client's $1 million kitchen renovation. The pattern was so ingrained that I had learned to accept it as simply the way our family worked. Rebecca was the star, I was the supporting cast member. She was the main character, I was the backdrop. It hurt, but it was familiar hurt, like an old injury that aches when it rains but doesn't stop you from functioning. What I didn't realize was that my father had been watching this dynamic play out for decades, and it troubled him far more than he ever let on. While my mother basked in Rebecca's reflected glory and treated her like a prized show dog, my father had quietly observed the toll that favoritism was taking on both of his daughters, turning one into a self-centered princess and the other into someone who believed she didn't deserve better. But I wouldn't learn about my father's true feelings until the day of his funeral, when everything I thought I knew about our family would be turned upside down by a letter that had been waiting 35 years to be read. The morning of September 15, 2019, started like any other Sunday in my small Bronx apartment. I was sipping coffee from a chipped mug while scrolling through job listings on my laptop, hoping to find a position that would finally allow me to start building real savings instead of just treading water financially. At 35, I was tired of living paycheck to paycheck while watching my younger sister post Instagram photos from her latest European vacation. My phone rang at 7:43 a.m., which was unusual because my family rarely called me, especially not on weekends. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen, and my first thought was that she must have dialed me by accident. "Sarah?" Rebecca's voice was shaky, which was alarming because Rebecca never sounded anything but completely composed. "Yes, what's wrong?" "It's Dad. He had a heart attack last night. He didn't make it." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down heavily on my small couch, the phone trembling in my hand. "What do you mean he didn't make it?" "He died, Sarah. Dad died." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, arrangements, and the surreal process of trying to accept that my father, the man who had always been the stable, quiet presence in our chaotic family, was gone at 68 years old. Robert Mitchell had suffered a massive heart attack while reading in his home office, his favorite room in the house lined with bookshelves and family photos. My mother had found him slumped over his desk around midnight when she went to tell him to come to bed. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. I took emergency leave from my job at the literacy nonprofit and drove my 10-year-old Honda Civic to Westchester County, my hands shaking as I navigated familiar roads that led to a house that would never feel the same again. When I pulled into the circular driveway of my childhood home, I saw Rebecca's Range Rover already parked outside, along with Bradley's BMW and my mother's Mercedes. Inside, the house buzzed with activity that felt obscene so soon after death. Rebecca was on the phone with the funeral director, her voice crisp and efficient as she discussed flower arrangements and service times. Bradley sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, presumably handling the financial and legal aspects of death with the same methodical approach he brought to his investment banking career. My mother sat in the living room surrounded by photo albums, selecting pictures for a memorial display. "Sarah," my mother called when she saw me. "Finally. We need help with the arrangements. Rebecca's been handling everything herself." This was typical. Even in death, my father's passing was being presented as Rebecca's burden to bear, with me cast as the tardy assistant arriving late to help with the real work. Never mind that I had driven 2 hours as soon as I received the call, or that no one had bothered to include me in any of the initial planning discussions. "What can I do to help?" I asked, setting down my overnight bag. "Well, Rebecca's already chosen the funeral home and booked the service for Thursday," my mother said, not looking up from a photo album. "She's selected the flowers, arranged for the catering after the service, and contacted all the relatives. I suppose you could help her finalize the music selections." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, still holding her phone. Even in grief, she looked perfectly put together in black slacks and a cashmere sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. "Actually, I've already chosen the music. Dad always loved classical, so I selected pieces from Mozart and Bach." Very dignified. The fact that our father's favorite music was actually classic rock from the 1970s, the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, the Beatles, seemed to have escaped Rebecca's notice. She had created a version of Dad that fit her aesthetic preferences rather than honoring the man he actually was. "Dad loved Hotel California," I said quietly. "Maybe we could include some of his actual favorite songs?" Rebecca waved dismissively. "Sarah, this is a funeral, not a classic rock concert. We need to maintain some dignity." Once again, my knowledge of our father's preferences was deemed irrelevant compared to Rebecca's vision of how things should be. I had spent countless hours in his car listening to his favorite radio stations, singing along to songs that made him smile and tap his fingers on the steering wheel. But those memories apparently didn't count when measured against Rebecca's ideas about proper funeral etiquette. Over the next 4 days, I watched my family plan and execute a memorial service that felt like it was for a stranger. The funeral home was decorated with formal white flower arrangements that looked like they belonged at a corporate event rather than a celebration of a man who grew tomatoes in his backyard and told Dad jokes that made his eyes crinkle with laughter. The photo display Rebecca curated featured professional family portraits and pictures of my father at company events, his awards from the pharmaceutical company, and images of him looking serious and distinguished. Missing were the candid shots of him grilling hamburgers at family barbecues, teaching Rebecca and me to ride bikes, or making silly faces at the camera during Christmas morning gift opening sessions. The guest list was another source of subtle conflict. Rebecca had invited her entire social circle from Yale, Bradley's business associates, and various family friends who had been impressed by her accomplishments over the years. Meanwhile, many of my father's actual close friends, guys he'd known since high school, colleagues from his early career, neighbors he'd coached in Little League, were somehow deemed not the right fit for the service Rebecca was planning. "We want this to be dignified," she explained when I questioned why Dad's best friend from college, Frank Morrison, wasn't on the invitation list. Frank's nice enough, but well, you know how he is at parties. This isn't the place for his stories. The stories Rebecca wanted to exclude were exactly the ones that captured who our father really was: funny, warm, human. But this funeral was being designed to reflect the image of the Mitchell family that Rebecca wanted to project to the world, not to honor the actual man we had lost. As the funeral date approached, I found myself feeling increasingly disconnected from the proceedings. This elaborate event being planned around me felt like it was for someone else's father, someone more refined and formal than the man who used to surprise Rebecca and me with impromptu ice cream runs on hot summer evenings. I spent those 4 days staying in my childhood bedroom, which looked exactly as it had when I moved out 16 years earlier. The twin bed with its faded pink comforter, the small wooden desk where I'd struggled through high school homework, the collection of participation trophies from various activities I'd tried and quietly quit when it became clear I would never achieve Rebecca-level success. From my bedroom window, I could see into my father's office, where the light stayed on all night because no one could bear to turn it off yet. His reading glasses still sat on the desk next to an open book, a biography of Theodore Roosevelt that he'd been halfway through when he died. His coffee mug, still containing the cold remnants of his last cup, sat on a coaster my mother had given him for Father's Day 15 years earlier. These small, intimate details of his life felt more real to me than the formal memorial service being planned downstairs. This was the father I remembered, the one who read biographies of presidents because he found history fascinating, who always used coasters to protect furniture, who drank his coffee black and strong. But when I mentioned these observations to Rebecca, suggesting we might incorporate some of these personal touches into the funeral, she looked at me as if I'd suggested we screen home movies during the eulogy. "Sarah, we're not putting Dad's coffee mug on display," she said with barely concealed exasperation. "This needs to be tasteful." The word tasteful was one of Rebecca's favorites, and it was always deployed to dismiss anything that didn't align with her vision of how things should look. My suggestions weren't wrong, necessarily, but they weren't tasteful according to Rebecca's standards, which meant they didn't matter. On the morning of the funeral, I woke up in my childhood bed with a heavy feeling in my chest that went beyond normal grief. I was mourning not just my father's death, but the realization that even his funeral would follow the same pattern that had governed our family for decades. Rebecca's preferences would take precedence, her vision would be implemented, and my feelings and memories would be politely dismissed as irrelevant. I put on the one black dress I owned, a simple knee-length style I'd bought 3 years earlier for a work event, and applied minimal makeup with hands that still trembled slightly. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who looked tired and sad, but not particularly elegant or camera-ready. I knew that when photos from this day were displayed in our family home, I would once again be the one who looked unprepared and out of place. Downstairs, Rebecca moved through the house like a graceful conductor orchestrating a complex symphony. She wore a sophisticated black sheath dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, along with pearls that had belonged to our grandmother and shoes that clicked authoritatively across the hardwood floors. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, and she carried herself with the poise of someone who knew she would be the center of attention at this event, even though it was meant to honor our father. "Sarah, thank goodness you're ready," she said when she saw me. "The cars will be here soon. Bradley's already loaded the flowers, and Mom's finished getting dressed. Did you prepare anything to say during the service?" This was the first I'd heard about family members speaking during the funeral. "I didn't know we were giving speeches." "Well, I'm delivering the main eulogy, of course, and Mom's going to read a poem. I thought you might want to say something brief, but if you haven't prepared anything, that's fine too." The casual way she mentioned that she would be giving the main eulogy felt like another small slap. She had appointed herself the primary spokesperson for our family's grief without consulting anyone, and my potential contribution was being framed as an optional afterthought. "I'd like to say something about Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course, but keep it short. The service is already quite full with the music and readings we've planned. The funeral service itself unfolded exactly as Rebecca had designed it. The church was filled with well-dressed people who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about what a distinguished man my father had been, how successful he'd been in his career, what a lovely family he'd raised. The Mozart and Bach music played solemnly while Rebecca's elaborate floral arrangements created an atmosphere of formal mourning. When it came time for the eulogy, Rebecca walked to the podium with the same confident stride she'd used to accept awards throughout her academic career. She had prepared extensive remarks that painted a picture of our father as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, and a devoted family man who had raised 2 daughters to be accomplished women. Her speech was articulate and moving in its way, but it felt like she was describing someone I'd never met. The father she described was one-dimensional, defined entirely by his professional achievements and his role in producing successful offspring. Missing from her eulogy was any sense of his personality, his humor, his kindness, or the small daily actions that had made him who he was. When Rebecca finished, there was polite applause, and then my mother walked to the podium to read a poem about loss and memory. Her presentation was brief but emotional, and she appeared appropriately grief-stricken in a way that garnered sympathetic murmurs from the assembled guests. Then it was my turn. I had spent the morning trying to think of what I wanted to say about my father, and I realized that what I missed most about him were the small moments, the way he hummed Beatles songs while doing yard work, how he always asked about my work with literacy programs even when no one else seemed interested, the fact that he kept that gap-toothed photo of me on his desk for 27 years. But as I walked to the podium and looked out at the sea of expectant faces, I felt the familiar weight of being the less eloquent daughter, the one whose words would inevitably pale in comparison to Rebecca's polished presentation. My father was a good man, I began, my voice smaller than I'd intended it to be in the large space. He was kind and patient and, he always made time to listen when I needed someone to talk to. I paused, looking for words that would capture what he'd meant to me without sounding unsophisticated compared to Rebecca's elegant speech. He taught me that success isn't just about achievements you can put on a resume. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching and how you show up for the people you love. I spoke for maybe 2 minutes, sharing a few memories about his sense of humor and his generosity, before concluding with, "I'm grateful he was my father, and I'll miss him every day." The applause was polite but brief, and I could sense the collective feeling that I had provided a nice, simple tribute that complemented Rebecca's more substantial remarks. Once again, she had delivered the main course while I provided a modest side dish. As I returned to my seat, I caught Rebecca's eye and saw a look I recognized from childhood, a mixture of pity and slight embarrassment, as if she felt bad that I hadn't been able to rise to the occasion but wasn't particularly surprised by my limitations. The reception after the service continued the same pattern. Rebecca held court near the photo display, graciously accepting condolences and sharing memories with guests who praised her eloquent eulogy. She moved through the crowd like a natural hostess, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and properly attended to. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of the room, making small talk with relatives I hadn't seen in years and listening to people share their memories of my father. These conversations were warmer and more authentic than the formal speeches, filled with stories about his kindness, his terrible golf game, and his legendary grilling skills at company picnics. It was during one of these conversations with my father's colleague, James Wright, that I learned something that would haunt me for the rest of the day. "Your father talked about you all the time," James said, squeezing my arm gently. "He was so proud of the work you do with those literacy programs. He'd show everyone pictures of you at the office Christmas parties." "He did?" "Oh yes. He'd say, 'My daughter Sarah is changing kids' lives one book at a time.' He thought what you did was more important than any of the pharmaceutical industry stuff we were all involved in." This was news to me. My father had never expressed particular pride in my work beyond polite interest, at least not that I'd witnessed. His attention had always seemed focused on Rebecca's more visible achievements. He also. James hesitated, as if deciding whether to share something. He used to worry that he and your mother hadn't been fair to you kids. He said Rebecca got all the attention, but you were the one with the real character. I felt tears prick my eyes. He said that? Many times. He felt guilty about it, I think. Said he should have spoken up more, made sure you knew how much he valued you. As the reception wore on, I had several similar conversations with my father's friends and colleagues. Apparently, Robert Mitchell had spent years talking about his daughter Sarah's compassion, her independence, her resilience in the face of challenges. He had been proud of my work, proud of my character, proud of the woman I'd become despite the lack of support he and my mother had provided. But he had never said any of this directly to me. The day ended with me helping to clean up the church hall while Rebecca supervised the removal of her elaborate floral arrangements, most of which would be preserved for display at the house. As I folded chairs and collected stray programs, I felt a deep sadness that went beyond grief for my father's death. I was mourning all the conversations we never had, all the pride he felt but never expressed, all the time we wasted following a family script that cast one daughter as the star and the other as the understudy. That night, I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about James Wright's words. Had my father really been proud of me all these years? Had he seen value in my choices even when the rest of the family treated them as consolation prizes? And if so, why had he never told me directly? The questions kept me awake until dawn, and I woke up feeling emotionally exhausted and confused. The funeral was over, my father was buried, and life would go on with the same patterns that had always governed our family. Rebecca would return to her privileged life in Brooklyn Heights, I would go back to my modest apartment in the Bronx, and nothing would fundamentally change about who we were or how we related to each other. Or so I thought. What I didn't know was that my father had left behind something that would shatter every assumption I'd made about our family, expose truths that had been hidden for decades, and finally give me the voice I'd never known I had. The letter was waiting in his desk drawer, sealed and addressed to me, containing words that would change everything I thought I knew about being Robert Mitchell's daughter. 3 days after the funeral, our family gathered at the law offices of Pembroke, Hughes and Associates in White Plains to hear the reading of my father's will. The mahogany-paneled conference room smelled of leather and expensive cologne, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a carefully manicured courtyard that probably cost more to maintain than my annual rent. I sat in an uncomfortable leather chair across from Rebecca and Bradley, who looked perfectly at home in this environment of wealth and legal formality. Rebecca wore a navy blue designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her blonde hair pulled back in a professional chignon that made her look like she belonged in a boardroom. Bradley checked his phone periodically, no doubt monitoring his various investment portfolios even during family legal proceedings. My mother sat at the head of the table in a black St. John knit suit, her silver hair styled in the same elegant bob she'd worn for 20 years. At 72, Margaret Mitchell still carried herself like the beauty queen she'd once been, and the expensive jewelry she wore, even to a will reading, reminded everyone present of her social status. I had worn my one professional outfit, a black blazer I'd bought at Target 2 years earlier, paired with dress pants that were starting to show their age. Next to my impeccably dressed family members, I felt like I was playing dress-up in clothes that didn't quite fit the role I was supposed to fill. Theodore Pembroke, our family's lawyer for the past 15 years, was a distinguished man in his 60s who had handled all the Mitchells' legal affairs with discretion and efficiency. He sat behind an imposing desk with my father's will in front of him, along with several other documents I couldn't identify from my position across the room. Before we begin with the formal reading, Mr. Pembroke said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, I want to express my condolences again. Robert was not just a client but a friend, and he will be greatly missed. Rebecca dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed her makeup remained perfect. Thank you, Mr. Pembroke. Dad always spoke highly of you." The feeling was mutual. He opened the leather folder containing the will. Now, Robert's will is quite straightforward in most respects. He was very clear about his wishes and took care to ensure everything was properly documented. My mother leaned forward slightly. "We assume everything is in order." Robert was always so meticulous about these things. Indeed he was. Mr. Pembroke began reading from the document. "To my beloved wife Margaret, I leave the family home in Westchester County, along with all its contents, and the sum of $500,000 from our joint investment accounts." My mother nodded, as if this was exactly what she had expected. The house was worth at least $1.8 million, and the additional cash would ensure she could maintain her lifestyle indefinitely. "To my daughter Rebecca Mitchell Stone, I leave the remainder of my investment portfolio, valued at approximately $1.2 million, along with my collection of first-edition books and my father's pocket watch." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the investment portfolio. I did quick math in my head. Between the cash, investments, and family heirlooms, she was inheriting well over $1 million, not counting whatever additional inheritance she might receive when our mother died. "And to my daughter Sarah Mitchell," Mr. Pembroke continued, "I leave my personal effects from his office, including his desk, books, and photographs, along with the sum of $50,000. The silence in the room was deafening. $50,000. While Rebecca received over $1 million plus valuable family heirlooms, I was getting office furniture and an amount that wouldn't even cover my remaining student loan debt. I felt the familiar sting of being the afterthought daughter, even in death. My father had provided generously for my mother's security and Rebecca's future, while giving me what amounted to a modest settlement that acknowledged my existence without significantly changing my circumstances. Is that all for Sarah?" my mother asked, and I couldn't tell if she was surprised by how little I'd received or just confirming that the disparity was as dramatic as it sounded. "That concludes the specific bequests, yes," Mr. Pembroke said, glancing at me with what might have been sympathy. "However, there is one additional item." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a sealed white envelope with my name written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting. Robert gave me specific instructions that this letter should be given to Sarah immediately following the reading of the will, and that it should be read aloud to the entire family. Rebecca frowned. Read aloud? Why would Dad want a private letter read in front of everyone? "Those were his explicit instructions," Mr. Pembroke said, handing me the envelope. "Sarah, would you like to read it, or would you prefer that I do so?" I took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. Part of me wanted to decline, to take the letter home and read it privately, away from the judgment and scrutiny of my family. But my father had specifically requested that it be read aloud, and I felt I owed it to him to honor that wish. "I'll read it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I opened the envelope carefully and unfolded 2 pages of my father's careful handwriting. As I began to read, I could feel my family's attention focus on me with an intensity I'd rarely experienced. "My dearest Sarah," I began, and my voice caught slightly. I cleared my throat and started again. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this letter, then I am gone, and you have just learned about the contents of my will. I know the financial bequests seem unfair, and I need to explain why I structured things the way I did." I paused, glancing up at my family. Rebecca looked puzzled, while my mother's expression was unreadable. Bradley was finally paying full attention instead of checking his phone. "First, you should know that the $50,000 I left you is just the beginning. What I couldn't include in my will, for reasons that will become clear, is information about the trust fund I established for you 15 years ago." My heart started beating faster. A trust fund? I had never heard anything about a trust fund. When you were 20 years old and struggling to pay for college, I watched our family fail you in ways that broke my heart. I saw your mother and sister dismiss your achievements, minimize your struggles, and treat you like you were less valuable than Rebecca. I was too much of a coward to challenge this pattern directly, but I wasn't going to let it ruin your future. The room was completely silent except for the sound of my voice reading my father's words. I could feel Rebecca shifting uncomfortably in her chair. I began setting aside money for you then, Sarah. Every month for 15 years, I put $2,000 into a trust fund that your mother and sister knew nothing about. That fund has been invested conservatively and has grown to approximately $450,000. I stopped reading and stared at the paper, certain I had misread the number. $450,000? That was impossible. Keep reading, Mr. Pembroke said gently. But that's not all, I continued, my voice shaking now. When I saw how Rebecca and your mother spent money on frivolous things while you struggled to pay for textbooks, I started a second account. Every time they spent money on something unnecessary for Rebecca, expensive clothes, trips, jewelry, spa treatments, I matched that amount and put it into an investment account for you. Rebecca made a small sound of protest, but Bradley put a warning hand on her arm. Over the years, this guilt money account, as I called it privately, has grown to approximately $320,000. Combined with your original trust fund, you now have access to approximately $770,000. The silence in the room was thunderous. I looked up at my family and saw expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been anger. But wait, there's more, I continued reading, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper steady. The house in Westchester that I left to your mother has been mortgaged to fund a third account for you. She owns the house, but she also owns a mortgage of $500,000 that comes due in 6 months unless she can refinance or pay it off. My mother gasped audibly. That's impossible. The house has been paid off for 10 years. I secretly remortgaged it last year, I continued reading from the letter, and used that money to purchase a rental property in your name, Sarah. The property is a 4-unit apartment building in Yonkers that generates approximately $48,000 annually in rental income. It's fully managed by a property management company, so you don't need to do anything except collect the monthly deposits. I had to stop reading for a moment because the numbers were becoming overwhelming. In the space of 2 pages, I had learned that my father had secretly made me financially independent while letting me struggle for years thinking I was on my own. Sarah, Rebecca said, her voice tight with emotion I couldn't identify, this can't be real. Dad wouldn't have done this without telling us. Mr. Pembroke reached into his file folder and withdrew several official-looking documents. I can confirm that everything in the letter is accurate. I helped Robert establish all of these accounts and investments over the years. Sarah, you're now worth approximately $1.3 million in liquid assets, plus you own income-generating real estate. The room erupted in shocked voices talking over each other. My mother was demanding to know how Robert could have mortgaged their house without her knowledge, Rebecca was insisting there must be some mistake, and Bradley was asking detailed questions about the legal implications of these revelations. But I kept reading, because there was still half a page left. Sarah, you're probably wondering why I did all this in secret instead of just treating you fairly from the beginning. The truth is, I was a coward. I was too weak to stand up to your mother's favoritism toward Rebecca, too concerned about keeping peace in our marriage to fight for the daughter who needed an advocate. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I continued reading. I watched you work multiple jobs to pay for college while we funded Rebecca's entire Yale education. I watched you struggle to afford textbooks while we paid for Rebecca's sorority dues and spring break trips. I watched you graduate with honors and no one in our family seemed to care, while Rebecca's mediocre achievements were celebrated like Olympic victories. Rebecca stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. I had excellent grades at Yale, and my achievements were not mediocre. Sit down, Rebecca, my mother said sharply, though her face was pale. Every time I watched this family fail you, Sarah, I put more money in your accounts. When you called to tell us about your promotion at the nonprofit and your mother changed the subject to Rebecca's latest interior design project, I deposited $5,000 into your trust fund. When you mentioned that your car was breaking down and we ignored it while buying Rebecca a new Range Rover the same month, I bought you 1,000 shares of Apple stock. I was sobbing now, but I forced myself to keep reading because these words felt like my father was finally speaking directly to me from beyond the grave. You deserved so much better from us, Sarah. You deserved parents who celebrated your compassion, your work ethic, your integrity. You deserved a family that recognized that helping struggling children learn to read is more important than designing expensive kitchens for wealthy clients. You deserve to be seen and valued for who you are. This is insane, Rebecca said, though she had sat back down. Dad is making it sound like we were terrible to Sarah, but we weren't. She always had food and clothes and a place to live. I looked up at her through my tears. That's not what love looks like, Rebecca. That's what obligation looks like. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. I returned to the letter for the final paragraphs. Sarah, I know this information is overwhelming, but I want you to understand that you earned every penny of this money. Not through any specific action, but through being exactly who you are, kind, hardworking, resilient, and good. You stayed true to your values even when no one seemed to notice or care. You built a life of purpose even when we failed to support your dreams. The money comes with only one condition. I want you to use some of it to pursue whatever dreams you've been putting off because you couldn't afford them. Travel if you want to travel. Go back to school if you want more education. Start your own nonprofit if you want to expand your impact. Buy a house if you want stability. The choice is yours, but choose something that makes you happy. Finally, I need to address the rest of my family, who I know are hearing this and probably feeling angry or confused. Margaret, Rebecca, this is not about punishing you. This is about correcting a pattern of favoritism that I should have addressed years ago. You have both lived privileged lives funded by my income. Sarah lived a constrained life despite being equally deserving of support and opportunities. My mother was crying now, though whether from grief, guilt, or anger, I couldn't tell. I hope this revelation will help all of you understand that love is not a finite resource. Supporting one daughter doesn't require neglecting the other. Celebrating one child's achievements doesn't require dismissing the other's efforts. I failed to teach you this when I was alive, but maybe this letter can teach you now. I took a shaky breath and read the final lines. Sarah, you are not now and never were the consolation prize daughter. You are not less valuable than Rebecca, less deserving of investment, or less worthy of pride and attention. You are remarkable exactly as you are, and I should have told you that every single day. I hope this money can give you the freedom to build the life you deserve, the one I should have helped you build all along. With all my love and deepest apologies for taking so long to make this right, Dad. When I finished reading, the conference room was silent except for the sound of multiple people crying. I set the letter down on the table and looked at my family, really looked at them, for the first time with the knowledge that everything I had believed about my worth and my place in our family had been wrong. Rebecca was staring at the table, her perfect composure finally cracked. My mother was wiping tears from her cheeks with a tissue, her usual imperious expression replaced by something that looked like devastation. Bradley was examining his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the scene. Mr. Pembroke cleared his throat gently. Sarah, I have all the paperwork here for you to sign to access your accounts. The trust funds can be transferred to your name immediately, and I can arrange for you to meet with the property management company this week if you'd like to see your building. I nodded numbly, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of 20 minutes, I had gone from being the financially struggling daughter who inherited office furniture to being independently wealthy with multiple income streams. But more than the money, I had finally received something I'd waited 35 years to hear: acknowledgement from my father that the family dynamic I'd endured my entire life had been unfair, and that I had deserved better. As we signed paperwork and made arrangements for transferring assets, Rebecca remained mostly silent. When we finally prepared to leave the law office, she approached me in the parking lot. "Sarah, I don't know what to say about all this." "You don't have to say anything," I replied, clutching the copies of my new financial documents. "But I do. I mean, I had no idea Dad felt this way about how we treated you." "How you treated me?" I looked at her directly. "Rebecca, you spent 35 years acting like I was an inconvenience in your family story. You dismissed my achievements, ignored my struggles, and treated me like I was lucky to be included in family events at all. That's not. I never meant." She trailed off, seeming to realize that her intentions mattered less than the impact of her behavior. "And at Dad's funeral," I continued, feeling a strength in my voice that I'd never had before, "you planned everything to reflect your vision of who he was, not who he actually was. You didn't include his favorite music, you didn't invite his real friends, and you gave a eulogy about a man I didn't recognize. I was trying to honor him appropriately. You were trying to honor the version of him that fit your image of what our family should look like. Just like you've been doing to me our entire lives." Rebecca's face flushed. "Sarah, that's not fair. I've always loved you. Love isn't just a feeling, Rebecca. Love is action. Love is paying attention to what matters to someone. Love is celebrating their successes and supporting them through challenges. Love is seeing them for who they really are, not who you think they should be." She stood there in the parking lot looking like I'd spoken to her in a foreign language. The concept that love required effort and attention rather than just theoretical affection seemed genuinely foreign to her. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally. "I don't know if you can," I replied honestly. But Dad's letter wasn't just about money. It was about finally telling the truth about our family. "And the truth is that you and Mom treated me like I was less important than you for 35 years. I got into my Honda Civic, the same 10-year-old car I'd driven to the funeral, and drove back to my modest apartment in the Bronx. But for the first time in my life, I was driving toward a future where I had choices, where I had security, and most importantly, where I finally understood that my worth had never been determined by my family's inability to see it." The letter had changed everything, not just my bank account, but my understanding of myself and my place in the world. I was no longer the forgotten daughter waiting for crumbs of attention. I was a woman with resources, options, and for the first time in my life, the power to write my own story. 2 weeks after the will reading, I was sitting in my small Bronx apartment, staring at bank statements that still didn't feel real. According to the documents spread across my coffee table, I now had access to $770,000 in liquid assets, owned a rental property generating nearly $50,000 annually, and had gone from struggling to pay rent to being financially independent overnight. But the money, as life-changing as it was, felt less important than what my father's letter had revealed about 35 years of family dynamics I'd misunderstood. Every memory from my childhood and adolescence was being re-examined through the lens of his words, and I was beginning to understand that my father's quiet presence hadn't been indifference, it had been guilt. My phone had been ringing constantly since the will reading. Rebecca had called 6 times, my mother had left 4 voicemails, and even Bradley had sent a text message asking if I wanted to discuss the family situation. I hadn't answered any of them. For the first time in my life, I had the luxury of choosing when and how to engage with my family, and I was taking time to process everything before deciding what I wanted those relationships to look like going forward. The first thing I did with my newfound wealth was quit my job at the literacy nonprofit. Not because I didn't love the work, but because I realized I could now fund my own literacy programs exactly the way I wanted them to run, without the constraints of limited budgets and bureaucratic oversight. The second thing I did was drive to Yonkers to see the apartment building my father had secretly purchased for me. It was a well-maintained 4-unit property in a decent neighborhood, with reliable tenants and a professional management company that had been handling all the day-to-day operations. Standing in front of a building I owned, watching families come and go from homes I was providing, felt surreal but also deeply satisfying. The third thing I did was make an appointment with a financial advisor to discuss how to manage my inheritance responsibly. I had spent so many years living paycheck to paycheck that suddenly having significant wealth felt overwhelming and scary. I needed professional guidance to ensure I didn't squander this opportunity my father had created for me. But perhaps the most important thing I did was schedule an appointment with Dr. Jennifer Williams, a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and trauma. Because as grateful as I was for my father's financial gifts, I was struggling to process the revelation that he had watched me suffer for decades while secretly trying to compensate with money instead of direct support. It's complicated grief, Dr. Williams explained during our first session. You're mourning your father's death, but you're also grieving the relationship you could have had if he'd been brave enough to address the family dysfunction while he was alive. She was right. Part of me was angry that my father had chosen to correct the family's favoritism after death rather than during life. If he'd understood how unfairly I was being treated, why hadn't he spoken up? Why had he let me believe for 35 years that I was less valuable than Rebecca? Guilt can be paralyzing, Dr. Williams continued. Some people find it easier to try to fix things secretly rather than confront the people who are causing the problem. Your father may have felt trapped between his love for you and his desire to maintain peace in his marriage. But I was his daughter too, I said, wiping tears from my eyes. Didn't I deserve to have him stand up for me? You absolutely did. And his letter suggests he knew that. The question now is what you want to do with this knowledge and these resources. Over the following weeks, I began to build a new life that reflected my own values and priorities rather than my family's expectations. I rented a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, ironically, just a few blocks from Rebecca and Bradley's house. The apartment had original hardwood floors, tall windows that let in gorgeous natural light, and enough space for a home office where I could plan my new charitable initiatives. I also enrolled in a master's program in education policy at Columbia University, something I'd always wanted to do but could never afford. With my new financial security, I could pursue education that would help me become more effective in my literacy work without worrying about student loan debt. But perhaps most importantly, I started the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Literacy and Learning, with an initial endowment of $200,000 from my inheritance. The Foundation's mission was to provide reading support and educational resources to underserved children, particularly those from families where education wasn't prioritized or valued. 3 months after the Will Reading, the Foundation hosted its first fundraising event, a small dinner at a beautiful restaurant in Manhattan, where I told the story of my father's secret legacy and challenged other donors to invest in children who might be overlooked by their own families. The event raised $75,000 in its first year, and more importantly, it established me as a serious philanthropist rather than just someone who inherited money. Local newspapers covered the story, praising my work in the innovative programs the foundation was funding. It was after one of these newspaper articles was published that Rebecca finally cornered me. I was leaving Columbia after a particularly engaging seminar on educational equity when I saw her Range Rover parked outside the campus gates. She got out when she saw me, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Sarah, we need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, adjusting my backpack. I was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, but I carried myself differently now. The constant financial stress that had weighed on me for years was gone, and it showed in my posture and confidence. "Yes, we do. This has gone on long enough." "What has gone on long enough?" Me having a life that doesn't revolve around your approval? Rebecca flinched. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Actually, I don't know what you mean anymore, Rebecca. For 35 years, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in our family. I thought I was the consolation prize daughter who should be grateful for whatever attention or resources came my way. Turns out I was completely wrong about that. Sarah, I've been thinking about what Dad wrote in that letter, and I want to make things right between us. Which part have you been thinking about? The part where he documented how you and Mom treated me like I was less important than you? Or the part where he felt so guilty about watching it happen that he spent 15 years secretly giving me money? She looked genuinely pained. I never realized. I mean, I didn't think I was treating you badly. That's part of the problem, Rebecca. You never thought about how you were treating me at all. You just assumed that since you were getting what you wanted, everything was fine. We stood on the sidewalk outside Columbia, two sisters who looked nothing alike and seemed to have lived completely different lives despite growing up in the same house. I read the article about your foundation, Rebecca said. It sounds like you're doing really important work. I am. And I'm good at it. I've always been good at it, but no one in our family ever seemed interested enough to notice. That's not true. Rebecca, when I got promoted to program coordinator 3 years ago, do you know what Mom's response was when I told her? Rebecca shook her head. She said, "That's nice, honey," and then immediately started talking about your latest interior design project. When I graduated magna cum laude from SUNY Purchase, you guys took me to Olive Garden to celebrate. When you got your interior design certificate, they threw you a party at the country club. I didn't realize the celebration was so different. Because you didn't pay attention. You never had to pay attention because everything was always about you anyway. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller than usual. I don't know how to fix this, Sarah. I don't know if you can fix it, I replied honestly. But maybe you could start by asking yourself why you want to fix it now. What do you mean? I mean, for 35 years, you were perfectly comfortable with the way our family treated me. You never questioned why I got less support, less attention, less investment. You never wondered if maybe the family dynamic was unfair. But now that Dad's letter has made it impossible to pretend everything was fine, suddenly you want to make things right. Are you saying I only care because of the money? I'm saying you only care because now you have to face the truth about how our family worked. And that truth is uncomfortable for you. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, which surprised me. I'd rarely seen her cry, and never over anything related to our relationship. Sarah, I love you. I've always loved you. But you never respected me. You never saw me as an equal. You never treated my achievements as important or my struggles as worthy of support. Love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect and consideration. I want to learn how to do better. It was the first time in my life that Rebecca had ever asked me to teach her something, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to reject her offer, to tell her it was too late and she'd had 35 years to figure out how to be a decent sister. But another part of me was curious about whether people could really change, especially when forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. If you're serious about that, I said finally, then you need to understand that this isn't about making some grand gesture or writing a check to my foundation. This is about fundamentally changing how you see me and how you interact with me. I'm willing to try. Are you willing to acknowledge that the way you've treated me for 35 years was wrong? Not just different, not just a misunderstanding, but actually wrong? Rebecca was quiet for a long time, and I could see her struggling with the question. Admitting that her behavior had been wrong meant admitting that she had hurt someone she claimed to love, and that her privileged position in the family had come at my expense. Yes, she said finally. I think. I think I was wrong. I think we all were. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was the first time she had ever acknowledged that our family's treatment of me had been unfair. It felt like a small but significant step towards something that might eventually resemble a healthy relationship. Rebecca, I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I have resources now, and options, and for the first time in my life, I don't need anything from our family. That means if we're going to have a relationship, it has to be because we actually enjoy each other's company and add value to each other's lives. I'd like that, she said. I'd like to get to know who you really are when you're not worried about money or feeling like you have to prove yourself. Over the following months, Rebecca and I began what could generously be called a rehabilitation of our relationship. She started asking questions about my work that went beyond polite interest, and she occasionally offered insights that were actually helpful. She also began sharing details about her own life that revealed she wasn't quite as confident and fulfilled as she'd always appeared. Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I am outside of being the successful daughter, she admitted during one of our coffee meetings. Like, what if I'm not actually good at anything? What if I've just been coasting on privilege this whole time? It was a level of vulnerability I'd never seen from her, and it helped me understand that being the favored child had created its own kind of pressure and insecurity. But the most significant change in my life came from an unexpected source, my mother. 6 months after the will reading, I received a handwritten letter from Margaret Mitchell, not an email, not a text, but an actual letter written on her expensive stationery and delivered by mail. Dear Sarah, it began, I have been thinking about your father's letter every day since it was read, and I realize that I owe you an apology that is long overdue and probably inadequate. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her recognition of the favoritism she'd shown Rebecca, her acknowledgement of the ways she'd dismissed my achievements and minimized my struggles, and her understanding that I had every right to be angry with her. I told myself for years that you were more independent, that you didn't need as much support as Rebecca, she wrote. But the truth is, I was lazy and selfish. It was easier to focus on Rebecca because she demanded attention, while you quietly handled whatever challenges came your way. I took your strength for granted and used it as an excuse to neglect my responsibilities as your mother. The letter concluded with an invitation to lunch, just the 2 of us, with no agenda other than getting to know each other as adults rather than as mother and disappointed daughter. I was skeptical, but curious enough to accept. We met at a small French bistro in Manhattan, neutral territory where neither of us felt completely comfortable. My mother looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, as if confronting the truth about our family had aged her. Sarah, I need you to know that your father talked about you constantly, she said after we'd ordered. At work, at social events, to anyone who would listen. He was so proud of your integrity, your compassion, your determination to help children who were struggling like you had struggled. He never told me that. I know, and that's my fault too. I created an environment in our house where your achievements were treated as less important than Rebecca's, and your father went along with it to keep peace. But privately, he worried constantly that we were failing you. She paused, taking a sip of her wine before continuing. I want to tell you some things that your father never had the courage to say directly. When you graduated magna cum laude from college, he wanted to throw you a big party, but I said it wasn't necessary because you didn't care about those things. When you got your promotion at the nonprofit, he wanted to take out an ad in the local paper celebrating your success, but I told him it would seem tacky. Each revelation felt like a small knife wound. My father had wanted to celebrate me, but my mother had convinced him I didn't want or need recognition. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I want you to understand that his love for you wasn't just about guilt money. He admired you in ways that he never admired Rebecca. He used to say that you had inherited the best parts of his character while Rebecca had inherited the worst parts of mine. What does that mean? It means you got his kindness, his work ethic, his genuine concern for other people. Rebecca got my vanity, my need for approval, my tendency to value appearance over substance. It was a harsh assessment of both daughters, but there was truth in it that I couldn't deny. Over the next 2 hours, my mother told me stories I'd never heard about my father's pride in my achievements, his concerns about my struggles, and his regrets about not being a stronger advocate for me within the family. She also shared her own regrets about the mother she'd been, the choices she'd made, and the damage she now realized she'd caused. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said as we prepared to leave. "I just want you to know that I finally understand what I did wrong, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to do better." "What would doing better look like?" I asked. "It would look like me actually paying attention to your life and your work instead of just asking polite questions. It would look like me bragging about your foundation to my friends the way I used to brag about Rebecca's interior design projects. It would look like me being the mother you deserved to have all along." 1 year after my father's death, the Sarah Mitchell Foundation had grown to employ 3 full-time staff members and serve over 500 children annually. We had opened a tutoring center in the Bronx, funded reading programs in 6 elementary schools, and provided scholarships for 20 high school students to attend summer enrichment programs. The foundation's annual gala was held at the Museum of the City of New York, with 200 attendees and a keynote speech from a renowned education advocate. The event raised $150,000 for our programs, and more importantly, it established the foundation as a serious player in the educational equity space. As I stood at the podium that evening, looking out at a room full of people who had come specifically to support the work I was passionate about, I thought about the letter my father had written but never lived to see me read. "My father left me more than money," I told the assembled guests. "He left me validation, recognition, and most importantly, the resources to build the life I'd always dreamed of but never thought I could afford." In the audience, I could see Rebecca and Bradley at their table, along with my mother, who had become one of the foundation's most effective volunteer fundraisers. Our family relationships weren't perfect, but they were honest now in ways they had never been before. "But the most valuable thing he left me," I continued, "was the understanding that your worth doesn't depend on other people's ability to see it. You can be remarkable even when the people closest to you fail to recognize it. You can be valuable even when your own family treats you as less important than you are." After the event, as I stood in the museum's beautiful lobby accepting congratulations and talking with donors about expanding our programs, Rebecca approached me. "Sarah, I just want you to know that I'm proud of you," she said, and for the first time, it sounded like she meant it. Not proud like, "good for you for trying," but proud like, "I'm amazed by what you've accomplished." "Thank you. That means a lot. I also want you to know that I've been thinking about Dad's letter a lot, and I think I finally understand what he was trying to tell us." "What's that?" "He wasn't just giving you money to make up for the ways we failed you. He was showing all of us what it looks like to actually invest in someone you believe in. All those years when we thought we were investing in me, we were really just funding my lifestyle. But what he did for you, secretly, consistently, over 15 years, that was real investment in a person's potential." It was perhaps the most insightful thing Rebecca had ever said about our family dynamics, and it showed a level of self-awareness I hadn't known she possessed. "I want to learn how to do that," she continued. "I want to learn how to see people for who they really are instead of who I think they should be. And I want to start with being a better sister to you." 2 years after reading my father's letter aloud in that law office, I was living a life I had never imagined possible. I had financial security, meaningful work, healthy relationships, and most importantly, a clear understanding of my own worth that didn't depend on external validation. The girl who had been mocked at her father's funeral for not being sophisticated enough, successful enough, or important enough had become a woman who was changing lives, building institutions, and creating the kind of legacy her father would have been proud to claim. But perhaps the most powerful transformation wasn't in my bank account or my professional achievements. It was in my relationship with my family, which had evolved from dysfunction and favoritism into something approaching honesty and mutual respect. We weren't perfect, and we probably never would be. But we were finally telling the truth about who we were and how we treated each other, and that truth had created space for all of us to become better versions of ourselves. My father's letter hadn't just changed my life, it had forced our entire family to confront decades of harmful patterns and choose whether to perpetuate them or change them. The money had given me options, but the words had given me something even more valuable, the knowledge that I had always been worthy of love, respect, and investment, even when the people who should have provided those things were too broken or cowardly to do so. In the end, that was the most precious gift my father had left me, not financial security, but the understanding that my worth had never been conditional on anyone else's ability to recognize it. I was remarkable exactly as I was, and I always had been. The letter had simply made that truth impossible to ignore.